Hello. All right, hi everyone. Now we're going to start with our intro HTML CSS lecture. I'll do the first half and then Andrew will take over the second half. So why does HTML and CSS matter? So at the top we have our Café Bon Appetit website, and this website is essentially broken down into HTML and CSS. So on the left we have the HTML. So with just HTML we kind of have something that looks like this. It doesn't look too pretty, but we have the structure of HTML, and we're able to make it as pretty as what we have on the right with CSS. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and HTML essentially is the language that our web browser uses to describe the content and structure of web pages. So essentially we can kind of think about HTML and CSS like this. HTML is like the skeleton, and then JavaScript, which we will learn later today, is kind of like the functionality. And then CSS is what makes our website look pretty, and this kind of goes for all of these analogies here. So HTML is essentially a bunch of nested boxes. So we have a website here, and maybe it's not too apparent where all the boxes actually are, but at first we have the whole website, which is one box, and this can be composed down into maybe these three smaller boxes here, or sorry, this whole box, and then that can be broken down into these three smaller boxes, and so on. So maybe a bunch of more boxes, more boxes, more boxes, more boxes. So now this is kind of what HTML will look like. So we have, this is some HTML code. We have our doc type, which is HTML. And then we have our tag here and tag here, which means we're going to be using HTML. And so essentially what this HTML does is it actually renders this on the right. So we have our doc type HTML. We have our HTML tag, which we'll talk about a bit, or we'll talk about now. We have our HTML tag, which has an opening tag and our closing tag. The opening tag is denoted with this sign, the tag name, the right. And then our closing tag is the same thing, but with the / here. So inside of our HTML, we essentially have multiple boxes with opening and closing tags. So first we have our HTML tag, and then we have our head tag, our body tag, our title tag, H1 and P. H1 stands for heading, and P stands for paragraph. So so the next question is how do we use these tags, and how do we nest them? So this nesting here is not allowed. So whenever we have an opening tag A and then we have an opening tag B, the opening tag for B or the closing tag for B should follow before the closing tag for A. So with our HTML here, we have our opening tag for HTML, our closing tag for HTML, and we have our opening and closing for head, or opening and closing for body. Inside of our head tag, which our head tag contains metadata for our website. So metadata for this website, for example, would be our title here that you would see on your browser. And we notice here that this title actually appears on our tab in our browser. The body, on the other hand, actually contains the text of the website. So in this body, we have our heading, H1, and our paragraph, P. Oh, sorry. Okay. So next, what are HTML attributes? HTML attributes go to the inside of the tags with the attribute and the value of the attribute inside of the opening tag. So on the left side of the equal sign, we have our attribute name, and on the right side, we actually have the value of the attribute that we're going to assign to that tag. Next, we have we're going to learn about some other tags. So for inserting links, we use the A tag, and the A essentially stands for anchor. And so if we have a website here that has maybe a link to web.lab, we would have our opening tag with our A, the attribute, which is href, and then our value, which is the link to our website. So this would actually look like this. we have our opening tag, our A, href, our website link, and then the text that we want to show between our opening and closing tag. So in this case, we have link to web.lab, and then that's the text that appears on our website. Next, inserting images. We use the tag img. So for the img tag, we have our attribute src, and then we have our image that we want to actually put into our website. So with this tag, we actually don't want to render any text. So we actually don't need the closing tag. So what we can do here is change the end of the opening tag to be a slash followed by the greater than sign. And this is called a self-closing tag. So this is actually what we'll render on the website. We have our image, the pushing GIF, which shows up on our website here. For the actual value of our attribute src, suppose we have this following folder structure. So we have like an application, and then inside of our app folder, we have a hello HTML file and our GIF that we're going to want to render. And so we actually put the directory of our GIF into the source here. So suppose we change the directory, and we create a folder, images, inside of the app folder, and then put our GIF inside of that image folder. We wouldn't actually use the same HTML attribute value pair anymore. We would actually change the value to be the image folder with the GIF inside, because we put the GIF inside of the folder. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. Next, we have list. There's a few different types of lists. We have ordered lists and unordered lists. Ordered lists are essentially like 1, 2, 3, and unordered lists are just bullets. And we use li for the actual items that go inside of the list. So this will look something like this. We have an unordered list inside of our body with our opening and closing tag ul. And then whenever we want to actually add some items into our list, we put our inside of the between the opening and closing tag, our li, and then the text that we want to show for the bullet. So in this case, item 1, and this will render on the right item 1 with a bullet. We can then keep adding items, so item 2 if we wanted to add a second item, and that would also render on the right. Next, we have a div and span. So div stands for a block section in the document, which we'll talk about in a second, and span talks about the inline section, which we'll also talk about in a second. So here's kind of an example using these two. So the first little block we have here uses the div tag, and we have inside of our div tag our header h2 and a paragraph. And down here, this renders with a block of the text with our div 1 and our paragraph. Then we actually have a second div, div 2 with a paragraph, and we can see that rendered in purple here. So the div is not really, the div tag doesn't really actually create it doesn't do any styling per se for us. It just actually puts a box around all of the things we put inside of the div. So by using this div tag here and this div tag here, we group the elements inside of the div tag. So in this in the first blocks, we group div 1 and paragraph together. And in the second, we group div 2 and paragraph together. And then at the bottom, we have span. So span doesn't inline. So if we have one span here, which this text is inside of a span element, and then we use another span with this text is inside of another span element, they actually render beside each other, whereas div renders like blocks on top of each other. So back to the code that we have. We had this code before, where we have our body and then just our h1 and our paragraph. But now maybe we want to put these inside of a div. So we put a div around our h1 and our paragraph. And this doesn't actually change how it renders on the right. It actually just groups these together into like one block. So that would be like kind of the block that's around our heading and our paragraph. And so far we've learned a lot of tags. We've learned a lot of tags like ul, span, and we will learn nav later in the workshop. But some general advice for using these tags is just kind of look them up online. There's a lot of tags that can be used for anything. We have header tags, paragraph tags, link tags, image tags, tags for nav bars, lists, and so on. So our general advice is to use the online documentation, which is the MD and Web Docs, which you can pull up just by going to your browser and just typing like HTML, MD, web docs, and that will come up on the first link. And in this resource, there's kinds of all different tags that you can see. So like head, title, body, header, footer, div, which we kind of saw, span, image, and there's hundreds of tags. And so this resource is really great for being able to like see what the tags do and how to use them and the attributes that they come with. And lastly, to utilize Google to see what tag is best. We haven't really we'll touch on this in a second, but all of the tags have their own properties and styles. And so it's not always best to use one tag. You can kind of use a lot of different tags, and so you don't have to create custom styling for them. So we just use div, and div put some elements into into blocks. So maybe one question that you have is why don't we always just use div, put these elements into blocks, and then style each block? And so why could this be bad? So a div is essentially just a pure container. It doesn't actually inherently represent anything except the elements that are inside of it. It just kind of groups elements together. And so we should only really use div whenever there's no other semantic elements or like h1 or paragraph, article, nav, or other like tags that are appropriate. So there might be some better options. And so this kind of gets into semantics. So a brief aside about semantics is why do we care about semantics and using the correct tag whenever we're able to? These are just two examples, but there's a lot online. The first is so that it's machine readable and friendly to web crawlers. So whenever robots or like web crawlers go onto your website, they're able to actually like read the HTML. And it's easier for humans to maintain in the future. If you use like header tags for headers or paragraph tags for maybe just regular text you're going to have on your website, it's just easier to see like, oh, we have a header here and this represents the header. So I guess like one conclusion you can draw from this is don't just always use div. Try to like use a lot of different tags whenever necessary, like use image tags, use link tags. And if you have any questions about like what tags to use, what tags are available, MDN is your friend. So just to recap, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, which is a language that essentially allows our web browser to describe the content and structure of web pages. And with that, I'll pass it on to Andy to cover CSS.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, so HTML and CSS go really hand in hand. So CSS is cascading style sheets, and it basically tells you the rules for like how to format stuff or how to make stuff look. HTML is pretty much like the bare bones, the skeleton. CSS is like the flesh, really the appearance. So if you have one takeaway today, just know that CSS is like a list of descriptions. Even like in the code itself, it looks like lists of descriptions. And it's used to style markup languages, primarily HTML, but also other markup languages that you don't really need to know, like XML. So like any website that's rendered on your browser is consisting of both HTML and CSS. And if we strip the CSS away, we see a very plain website that's not only not pretty, but it's also sort of functionally not great, because CSS adds a lot of like organization that makes a website much easier to use. So even if you just think like CSS is just like making it prettier, it actually does add like ease of use for your users, which is a really big like concern when you're making a website. So again, just saying it one more time, HTML is like your skeleton. With CSS, you're making like a styled skeleton, so a fully functioning website once you add JavaScript with it. So CSS consists of a lot of rule sets, or we might call them rules. And there's three key properties in a rule set. So we see over here div. We just learned what div is. It's like a block element. And this is what's called the selector in the CSS rule set. So the selector is pretty much like the element that all of these things inside the curly braces will apply to. And then inside these curly braces, we see three pairs of properties and values. These properties are predefined. So if you go online and search up like CSS properties, then you'll find a lot of properties like color, font family, display, width, height, stuff like that. And these values also come with like some predefined values, but it's like too much of a task or too much of a burden to memorize all of these. As always, Google is your friend. It's really not like useful or really required for you to like memorize all of these built-in or all these predefined properties and values. So always just Google when you're in doubt. Just going back here, like what exactly this like, or I guess we'll see it later. We're going back to the HTML file that we left off with, hello.html, and on the right, this is just the bare bones displaying of these two elements, the heading and the div. So we'll just take away the rest, sort of abstract it a bit. And then let's add another div called info, or I guess with the text info, and this is just for demonstration purposes. So if I wanted to style both these divs, I would use the div selector, and then put whatever styling I want inside these curly braces. And assuming that these two files are somehow linked, this is also sort of black box for now, like assuming that style.css and hello.html are linked, then this selector will apply to any div element within this file. So that means that these two texts are going to be read. Now, what if we just want to apply this red coloring to this info div? Well, we can do this using a concept called a class. So if we add class equals info inside these quotation marks to this div, now we can specify a selector that only applies to this class info. And we do this using the period. So we put a period, then the name of the class, so period info, and then put the same curly braces in the properties, and now the selector only applies to the classes. Notice that before this div, the paragraph div was also red. Now it's not because this class, this style is only applied to the info class. So now the code has changed a bit, but it's doing the same thing. We use the ID instead of class. Here we're doing the same thing. We have a string that's the name of the ID called unique. The only difference here is that we're using a hashtag instead of a period, but it's still doing the same thing because it's like only making the info red. So what exactly is the difference between ID and class then? So one key difference is that an element can only have one ID. Think of the ID as like a name. You can only have one name. Like you can't have multiple names. Whereas class, an element can have multiple classes, so you can think of this as like some sort of description of yourself. Like you can be a student, you can also be, I don't know, maybe like you're a 19-year-old, etc., stuff like that. And the way that we do this is we have an attribute called ID, and then we put the name of the ID inside quotation marks for the element that we want to apply it to. And then class, same thing. We have the element and then the attribute class, and then we split the classes with spaces, such as this one below. Another property is that IDs must be unique in a given HTML document. So this is basically saying like everyone has a different name. You can't have like two elements with the same ID or the same name. Whereas classes can be used on multiple elements. So it's basically reusable, which is really handy because that way you can like define a class, give it some like styling, or like define some styling for a certain class, and then like apply the same class to a lot of elements that like have the same style. Like if they're all elements of the same list, then you want them to have the same style, so you can like apply the same class to all of them. And then the key difference syntactically is just ID uses the hashtag and then class uses the period. So a bit of a tangent, this isn't too important, but CSS uses a hierarchy to determine like what styles actually get applied to a certain element. So inline style, we haven't talked about this. This is because it's like pretty bad to use. You can search it up if you want to like learn more about it, but basically you're using like CSS as an attribute to an HTML element instead of having it inside of a CSS file. Just ignore inline style for now. So we just talked about ID attributes. This is the highest specificity that you usually deal with. And the more specific something is, the higher priority it has when it for like what, I guess like the more specific it is, the higher priority it has for certain styles or certain properties. So for example, if like, I guess we'll see it later, but like if I have an element with an ID of like my ID and then a class of like class 1, and then the ID tells it to be red, but the class tells it to be blue, then it's going to be red because it's going to follow the more specific ID attribute instead of the class. At the bottom is div. And again, like this isn't too important, but if you want to read about it more, you can go to the slides and read about it. But the key takeaway is we really want to use only classes for CSS styling because they're reusable. IDs are pretty like not useful because you might as well write a class instead of an ID if you're going to like write all the code anyways, because then you might use the class elsewhere. So how do you combine HTML and CSS? And this is like the last main part of the lecture. So we have our HTML file, and then we include this link between the two files inside the head or the metadata. So inside the head, we have this element called link, and this link has two attributes: href, which is the file, the source, which is style.css, and rel, which stands for relationship, and this is always going to be a style sheet for a CSS file. And then once you have this linked, you can start using these CSS classes or CSS rule sets inside your HTML like so. Okay, so just a quick demonstration because I think this is pretty useful. If you open up your browser to any website, I'm just going to type up, or I'm going to open this website. You can see the HTML and the CSS being rendered on your website by right-clicking and then clicking Inspect. Yeah, so everything here is the HTML of this website. You can see that it has like the main HTML outside here, and then the head. You can see like the title up here, and then the body contains all the content underneath here. If you click on a specific element, one way you can do that is you press this button and then click on some element here, and then it selects like what the corresponding HTML code is. I'll make this a bit bigger. Can you guys see in the back? Okay. Yeah, so like you can click on this icon and then press some element, and then you see the corresponding HTML element. I think like this browser or this like tool is pretty good because then you see like the sort of nested structure of HTML. And at the same time, you actually see the CSS of these elements if you go to styles and then oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so these are all the CSS rule sets being applied to, let me click this element. So it has like the div rule set being applied, display block. And then as you go up, these rules are more and more specific. So this has an ID of main page. And then you see this is most specific. It's more specific than div. And it's making like these properties being applied to this this element. One cool thing is that like inside here, you can just maybe right-click this and then inspect. You can really change anything here and see what it looks like. You can type anything. And at the same time, I can also modify the CSS. If I don't see anything over here, I can like just say color is red, and then it changes the color to red. So if you're ever in this situation where you don't want to go back to your code for some reason and like change the CSS, you can also do it in your browser once you've rendered it. I think that's just pretty cool. And this is also pretty useful if you want to look at like the size of each of these elements inside of your HTML file, or inside of this browser rendering. This tool is pretty useful too, and we'll look into this feature more in the workshop. But yeah, in conclusion, these are the main takeaways. Just know that HTML is like nested boxes. This contains like the structure and the content of your website. And then CSS is a list of descriptions that style your HTML, make it look pretty, make it more accessible to the user, etc. Okay, I'm gonna take